Our audience, we're very concerned about what looks to be a dysfunction in the Beltway in Washington, D.C., as opposed to what's happening on Main Street. And I hear you saying that part of what the Civil Rights Commission should be doing is evaluating civil rights violations, and yet you're also having a discussion about whether you should continue or what you should do, while the reports certainly that we're getting are showing a rise in Islamophobia, a rise in hate crimes happening, including not only against people of color, immigrants, but gay and lesbian people. The Department of Justice is suing down in Arizona because of this particular sheriff down there that seems to have taken the law into their own hands. So that it seems to me, and our audience would want to hear, that there are plenty of civil rights violations going on right now, yet the one that I have heard that the commission is pursuing is the new Black Panther Party of these three guys, or whatever they are, in Pennsylvania or wherever that incident happened. So I'm wondering, when you're talking about evaluating civil rights violations, and the data is showing an increase in civil rights violations, what does that mean in terms of your brief for the Civil Rights Commission and what you do in the future? Are you going to continue to monitor or what? I'm a little confused.
Maybe I'll try to answer it, although the question is, what are you going to do? And of course, none of us are currently connected with the commission, but I have no reluctance to saying what they should do. Let me say two things about those comments. First, I think that the significant amounts of discrimination, maybe much less than 40 years ago, but to the extent that there is discrimination, whether the Justice Department and the other agencies are dealing with it or not, needs to be assessed. The data needs to be gathered. It needs to be analyzed so that government knows how to pinpoint it best. And that's an area where the Commission can cooperate with the executive agencies. I think it's very useful for the Commission to provide data that's useful to the executive. And you gave an example of one area where the Justice Department is already looking at something. Maybe they could get support from the Commission. But the other thing I would say is that in some ways the Commission is most valuable when it is not so much cooperating with the executive, but providing a check on it. And that in some ways the Commission shows its value most when it's in opposition. Right? The reason that the new Black Panthers case is worth discussing is not that it is the only or even the most important civil rights issue in this country, but rather because it is an issue which the Justice Department on its own was not looking into in a self-critical way and may not have been able to, right? So I think it is very valuable that the Commission not only provides support for the President or Congress, but that it also critically assesses what's being done or not being done in cases like that one, so that there are checks and balances.
Any others, comments?
Russell or Mindy, would you like to weigh in there?
No, I'm so disconnected from the Commission the last 5 years that I would point out, though, the Commission has no enforcement authority and is not the first responder to outbreaks of new kinds of discrimination like Islamophobia. That our enforcement report is evaluating the government's response, how it conducts enforcement and investigation. So that's all I would say.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sir?
Yes, I just have a historical question because I'm just not sure. When the commission was first established, was it charged with looking at historical issues, for example, the burning of the black business districts in Oklahoma, Nebraska? Those are the ones that people know about, but those were clearly acts of hate, acts directed against a particular group who had managed to be actually successful. I mean, we talk about being entrepreneurial and successful, and then when people get there, that it gets taken away from them. But I wanted to know, was that a part of its initial charge? And because if it is, there are a whole lot of other places that are not as famous in parts of the Deep South where there's been land expropriated from people through devious means, et cetera, et cetera. So was that a part of what the commission was supposed to look into? Clearly civil rights violations. I'm just curious historically. Old things that have current effects with wealth, et cetera.
Panelists, Ken?
Well, in 1957, in 1957, Congress had the sufficient will to create a commission to study something, but not sufficient political will to actually pass something with enforcement teeth. So they didn't create what became Title VII or Title VI that had actual enforcement teeth, and they did not enlarge the powers of the Civil Rights Division of Justice as they would do a few years later. And the main charge of the commission was to investigate civil rights violations, for instance, denial of voting rights.
Primarily by state governments.
Primarily by state governments, right? And that was an important role for the state advisory committees in somewhat early periods. It wasn't so much, as I understand it, looking back historically, as it was asking what's going on now and what needs to be done about it.
And sort of very legalistic denial of voting rights. I mean, very legalistic with very specific things like that.
Well, people may disagree about what's legalistic, but it was specific things like voting rights was a very important issue at that time, as was segregation.
Thank you.
Sir?
Good afternoon. Earlier there was a question about expanding the scope of the commission to include human rights issues. Professor Berry, you had mentioned that if Congress wants this information, they should be able to get it if there's an audience for it. I wanted to follow up to get your input on whether the commission itself should be the one to provide that information. In other words, is it proper for the commission to do that as opposed to perhaps another agency, perhaps something else that could be created? Thanks.
And this is just my opinion would be that the commission is probably best suited to take that on rather than to create another agency that would be parallel and could cause competition with the limited funds that Congress has been appropriating for these purposes. So that's, I do think of the resources to Congress and the White House, the commission is probably the best well-suited.
Follow-up question on that. What are human rights?
As I understand it, the proposal is for the commission to look at the rights that are established in international conventions and to determine whether the United States is in compliance with them. So that would include, for instance, the rights established within the Convention on the Elimination of Race Discrimination, or CERD. That deals with race discrimination issues and ethnic discrimination issues. So for the Civil Rights Commission to ask, is the United States in compliance with an international convention dealing with race discrimination, wouldn't be a huge stretch.
Is it a stretch at all? I guess that's if it has to do with race, isn't it already in the jurisdiction?
If it has to do with race, I think it's something the commission could probably do right now. Usually the commission doesn't involve itself in asking whether the United States is in compliance with treaty obligations, but I think it probably could find a hook. On the other hand, if the question is whether the United States is providing a level of health care or providing a level of education consistent with what might be either required or recommended by various international conventions, that might require a level of expertise that has nothing to do with discrimination, well, maybe not nothing, but which is not principally about discrimination, and which might relate more to the expertise within, say, the Department of HUD or education. Human rights, as it's now defined within international conventions, is very broad and includes a lot of topics that the Civil Rights Commission has never really developed skills in.
Sir.
Hi. I just have a quick question, mainly for, well, I guess for the panelists, but particularly Professor Marcus and Professor Barry. Professor Barry, you mentioned earlier that there were assortment of court opinions that come down on a regular basis that affect the fair enforcement of civil rights. And Professor Marcus, you also mentioned that there are a number of things that the commission does well when it's in opposition to, say, what the executive branch is doing or Congress. But there's also instances in which at least most of the commission members have voiced opposition to certain laws that would have been either consistent with its original mandate or the expansion of civil rights protections. Not the least of which was most members opposed the reauthorization of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which it was instrumental as an agency in promoting. It was also, most of the members came out in opposition to the recent hate crimes law that was passed. And it was also in opposition to the Liddy Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which basically would have shored up a really bad, the effect of a really bad decision affecting the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And so there was all these things that were consistent with its original mandate that the commission has expressed uncharacteristic opposition to, given that it's a civil rights agency. And I was just wondering, how do you draw the line, or what kind of distinction do you make between opposition to certain actions by the executive and congressional branch and actually advocating for the vigorous enforcement of civil rights, especially when it's consistent with its original mandate?
I guess my reaction is that the mission of the Civil Rights Commission cannot be that the commissioners must always support anything that's called civil rights legislation. Otherwise, when they do support it, it has no meaning. And with each piece of legislation, there's going to be a divergence of opinion. I do not think it's accurate to say that the Commission or any member of the Commission opposed the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. It is true that at least a couple of members of the Commission opposed reauthorization of certain then expiring provisions of the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, like Section 5. That was an issue where there were people who disagreed. Some thought that it was still useful. Others thought that other provisions of the Voting Rights Act were much more important. As I recall, the Commission as a whole did not weigh in on that because it was not something where there would be a consensus either way, and not even clear which way a majority would go. On the other two that you mentioned, they were after my tenure. It's my understanding that there again it was some members of the Commission that opposed legislation and not all of them. And in those cases, I understand that there were policy arguments on either side and important arguments on both sides, and that if we ever said that we need a publicly funded agency whose mission is automatically to support any sort of public policy, then that support would be meaningless.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you would join me in thanking our panelists.